How do you show up to pray at a synagogue where every Saturday morning they say a prayer for not just the state of Israel, not just in the sanctuary during the service, but they also say a prayer for the soldiers of the state of Israel. They say a prayer for wishing safety upon people carrying out a genocide. I mean, it would be the equivalent of entering a church in Germany in 1942, where they're praising Nazi soldiers, wishing safety on them as they send Jews off to the gas chambers.
All right. It is my pleasure to welcome to Bad Faith Podcast for the first time, Zachary Foster. Zach is a historian of Palestine and the founder of Palestine Nexus, an educational resource on Palestine. And he is recently the author of an article that made quite a few waves on Twitter and social media called The Forgotten History of Jewish Anti-Zionism. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I have an idea of why this particular article made so many waves and got so many retweets, why people were eager to share it. What's your sense of why this made an impact?
For many decades now, the Jewish establishment in the United States is avowedly Zionist. I would describe their ideology not as Judaism, but as Israelism. That is to say, the official religion of the American Jewish establishment is not Judaism, it's Israelism, which is a philosophy that says Israel, as a Jewish state, is a sacred entity, and anyone who calls into question Israel as a Jewish state, it can no longer be part of a Jewish institution as a board member, as a staff member, as just a rank and file member of the organization. And so for many decades now, this Jewish establishment has sought to convince Jews and everyone else in the world that Jews have always been Zionists, that all Jews everywhere in the world, from time immemorial to the present day, have embraced Zionism. But that's just a myth. That's just a lie. In fact, for most of the history of Zionism, I would say, a majority of world Jewry were opposed to Zionism. That was certainly the case from the 1870s all the way to the 1940s. And so I think the reason why people are interested in this subject is because it challenges what we believe or what we think we know about the history of Judaism and the history of Jews. So it's challenging the basic assumption that most people have about Zionism and the Jewish people's connection to Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, you do a really forensic examination of various communities over various time periods, starting back in the late 19th century, and also specifically talking about the feelings, the evolving attitudes of Jewish people in various parts of Europe and various parts of the Arab world. Let's start at the very beginning. I know this is going to be a little parochial for some of the listeners, but I think it's worth having a refresher. When does Zionism first emerge as a political project?
So the first sentence of that piece, I specifically point out that Jews have been opposed to Zionism since the 1870s. Of course, that's when Zionism first starts to get embraced by Jews. You have these proto-Zionists emerging in Europe in the 1870s. These are people before Theodor Herzl, who pens The Jewish State, which is a call for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, published by Theodor Herzl in 1897. But of course, Zionism long predates that. In fact, it long predates the Jewish embrace of Zionism beginning in the late 19th century. It goes back to, I would say, the 16th, 17th century. With the Protestant Reformation. You have in the 16th century, all of these Europeans challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, saying we don't need priests to interpret the Bible. We can read the Bible ourselves. A literalism movement in which you have all of these Christians in Europe, Protestants, returning to a literal reading of the Bible. And so they pick out verses in Genesis, chapter 12, chapter 15. They look at Deuteronomy. They look at the New Testament. And they say, look, the Bible itself predicts a return of the Jews to Palestine, an ingathering of the return of Jews to Palestine. And thus, beginning in the 1640s, you get a movement in Protestant England to establish a Jewish entity, a Jewish commonwealth, some kind of Jewish establishment in Palestine. And that movement picks up in the 1640s, 50s, and 60s. It's forgotten after the you have basically this movement is known as the Restorationists, and they get support from the Church of England. But after there's a change in power in England, that movement dies down, but gets revived again in 1799 by Napoleon himself, the French conqueror who actually invades Palestine in 1799 and calls for Jews around the world to come back to Palestine. He's having his forces are facing a lot of resistance in Palestine, and he believes that if he calls on Jews around the world and calls for the reestablishment or the establishment of some Jewish state in Palestine, we're talking in the late 18th century, that this will buttress his forces and his attempt to take over Palestine in the late 18th century. That movement fails, obviously. There's no Jewish return. There's no Jewish embrace of a Jewish state in Palestine in the 18th century. Then I would say the real beginnings of the political Zionism that we know today really begins, I would say, in the 1840s in Europe. Again, primarily in England, where you have another movement of restorationists. These people are Bible-believing Christians, and they believe that at the end of days, all the Jews in the world will return to Palestine. I'm putting return in air quotes here. They will congregate in Palestine, and if they don't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, they're going to burn in hell for all eternity. And so that movement of Christians, like I said, primarily, I would say the real blossoming happens in the 1840s. And it gets picked up in around Western Europe and the United States. You get all these Christian Zionists, again, long before there's any Jewish Zionists. The Jewish
this Zionists. Is what I'm thinking. I'm like, when are Jewish people going to start getting interested in Zionism in this narrative? Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, well, I would say one of the main reasons Jews have no interest in Zionism is because throughout this period, for the first half of the 19th century, and obviously long beyond that, Jews are trying to integrate into the societies in which they live. Traditionally, they've been ghettoized. They're living in ghettos. They don't have full rights in Europe and the United States, and they want to integrate. And that's why, by the way, beginning in 1870s, 80s, and 90s, when some Jews start to embrace Zionism, the vast majority of them reject it. They say, I'm a Jewish American, I'm a Jewish German, I'm a Jew, I'm a French Jew, I'm a British Jew. I'm trying to become British. I'm trying to become French. I'm trying to become German. I'm trying to become American. And they see Zionism as a threat to their ability to integrate and assimilate. Because the Jews are saying, because the Zionists are saying, Jews don't belong in the United States. They don't belong in Germany. No, they belong in Palestine. And that's why, by the way, they develop partnerships and alliances with anti-Semites. In fact, you could really say that a majority of the world's anti-Semites from the late 19th century all the way down to the 1940s are themselves Zionists. In fact, they're not just Zionists. They're the world's most prominent Zionists. They're the Zionists, like we could mention multiple examples. Istotzi, he's a politician in Hungary in 1878. He gives a speech before the Hungarian parliament calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. By the way, he also doubled as the leader and the spokesperson of the anti-Semitic movement in Hungary. Of course, the same is true of Wilhelm Marr. He's a German journalist. He actually coins the term anti-Semitism itself, and he's famous for pioneering a racial anti-Semitism, which replaced the religious anti-Semitism before it. But again, he also is a raging Zionist because he believes Jews are of an inferior race, and thus the Europeans, in order to purify Europe of all those inferior populations, needs to rid Europe of the Jews. And so obviously he's a Zionist because Zionists have the same view. They think, wow, we just need to rid Europe of the Jews, send them all to Palestine to establish some Jewish paradise in a land that is 95% non-Jewish. So that's the basic alliance that gets formed in many, many countries in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, beginning in the late 19th century. And that is, I would say, one of the main reasons why so many Jews are so hostile to Zionism for the first 6 decades of its existence.
So that's one of the reasons, the idea that people are trying to assimilate, they're trying to downplay differences within group to try to, mitigate anti-Semitism. There's some other reasons, though, that you write about, including that there were many leftist, Marxist Jews that saw the Zionist movement as sort of nationalist and like a nationalist, imperialist, separatist movement that was discordant with their values. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the main opposition to Zionism in the Russian Empire, and by the way, the Russian Empire was home to a huge percentage of world Jewry in the late 19th and 20th centuries. We're talking many, many millions of Jews living in what is today Poland, Russia, Romania, the Balkans, the Baltic states. So this is all part of the Russian Empire. And many of these Jews joined what was known as the Bund Party, the Bundists, they were known as. These are Jewish socialists. They believe that they believe in working class solidarity, right? They believe in workers of the world unite. And so they see Zionism, which is calling for a Jewish home in Palestine. They see those folks as hostile to working class solidarity for many reasons. The first was that in many cases, Zionists were themselves bourgeois. They were upper middle class. They were not really workers. They didn't care much about what the interests of the working class. So for that reason, they were hostile to the Zionist movement. But the other reason they were hostile to the Zionist movement, because the Zionists said the solution to anti-Semitism was leave. It was don't try to fight the anti-Semites in the Russian Empire. Don't try to organize against anti-Semitism in the empire. Just give up and move to Palestine. In fact, Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism that we mentioned, he travels to the Russian Empire in the early 20th century in 1901, I believe, and he meets with Russia's leading anti-Semites. He meets with von Plehve, who is, I believe, the Interior Ministry, and he meets with other Russian anti-Semites, one of whom actually claims that he had hoped to drown all of Russia's 6 million Jews in the Black Sea. So and this is Theodor Herzl going and meeting with him because again, they have the same goal. Both of them want to rid the Russian Empire of its Jews. Obviously, they have different reasons why they want that, but ultimately they have the same goal. And so the Bundists, these socialist Jews in the Russian Empire, primarily the Pale settlement, what is today basically Poland, these Jews are extremely hostile to the Zionists for the reasons we just said. As late as 1938, the Bundists commanded some 55% of the Jewish vote in the municipal elections throughout Poland. So the Bundists were dramatically more popular than the Zionists all the way up to the eve of the Second World War.
I actually don't know that much about Herzl's own sort of motivations. I mean, from your perspective, for your understanding of it, why do you think he was not skeptical of forming alliances with these kinds of people? And what was his end game? What does he get out of Zionism? What does he get out of the foundation of Israel?
It's a very good question. What's in it for him? He has actually no desire himself to move to Palestine, and he says that openly. He sees himself as Viennese, he's Austrian, he's German speaking. He has no desire to live in what he would consider the Orient, a place of barbarism and backwardsness where there's no civilization, there's no culture. That's his view of Palestine, right? So he has no desire to actually go to Palestine himself. He sees Zionism as a solution to the problem that Jews are facing in Eastern Europe. Because if you go back to the late 19th century, you have the pogroms taking place across Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, in the Pale settlement, in Ukraine, and it's Jews there where you have lots and lots of anti-Jewish violence. Whereas in Western Europe and in Central Europe, where Theodor Herzl's based and where his partner in crime Max Nordau is based, and where the Rothschilds are based, where basically the Zionist movement is getting the political support, it's getting financial backing. It's basically, you have really kind of these two groups of Zionists, where you have on the one hand, you have the Jews actually facing persecution. Those are the Jews living in the Pale settlement in the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe. And then you have Zionism's, call it political and financial support. That is coming primarily from Western Europe. And you could say Theodor Herzl, he's a journalist based in France in the 1890s, and he sees this this French Jew, Alfred Dreyfus. He's a military officer, and he's falsely accused of treason against the French Empire, and he spends 5 years in prison because of it. And that is often cited as one of the reasons why Herzl becomes an ardent Zionist. It's not actually clear if that's the case, though, whether or not that's actually just a recollection of him sort of reading into that trial later on in his life, that was the key moment in his transformation. Because remember, I mean, you have to remember the time and the place of Theodor Herzl. He is raised on this belief in a kind of a racial hierarchy of the entire world. Right. And so he sees all of these races, and all of these races need their own nation. Right. This is sort of the heyday of nationalism, where every group in the world has to have a state that represents the nation's interest and guarantees the nation's racial purity. And so that he is of this mind view that the Jews, well, OK, if we can't fit in somewhere in Europe, well, then we need to create a state somewhere else. And that's why, by the way, he proposes in the Jewish state, establishing a Jewish state in either Argentina or in Palestine. And it seems, based on that work, that he's relatively indifferent whether or not Jews go to Argentina or they go to Palestine. In the Third Zionist Congress in the early 20th century, there's a serious movement within the Zionist Congress during that time period to establish a Jewish state in East Africa, in British East Africa. And in fact, they even vote, I think it's the fifth resolution, an overwhelming majority of the Zionist delegates at that conference, was it 1903, they vote to support an investigatory commission to go see if Jews can create a Jewish state in British East Africa. So there's all these reasons, for nationalistic reasons, for racial purity reasons, for political reasons, why he ends up calling for a Jewish state in Palestine.
Which is why this is fascinating, because what you just described is a group of people actually under persecution who, regardless, given your stats about the percent of Eastern European Jews that were in this Bund party, majority of whom still resisted Zionism for a whole host of reasons. So let's cut forward to when Zionism starts to gain some real traction for obvious reasons after World War II and after the Holocaust. And I saw a lot of the sort of antagonistic response to on the internet, kind of selectively quoting the article and saying, yeah, of course, it's not a big mystery why suddenly Zionism became popular. But those responses, of course, don't contend with some of these underlying issues that so many people in the Jewish diaspora had with the foundation of Palestine, foundation of Israel, right up into that point. So can you talk about the evolution among Jews in the diaspora in their thinking about whether or not Zionism was finally a good idea?
Yeah, so as you correctly pointed out, a majority of world's Jewry after the Holocaust, after the Nazi annihilation of Europe's Jews, embraced Zionism. And like you said, for obvious reasons, in a world where Jews are facing persecution and total annihilation, doesn't it make sense that there should be a Jewish state to protect Jews? That's sort of the most common and most popular response. But there's another response. A minority of Jews come to the conclusion that the lesson from the Holocaust is not chauvinism, but it's universalism. In other words, the lesson is when you have a state and an ideology that talks about racial purity, and it talks about how minorities are destroying that racial purity, that ethnic, racial, national purity, and demonizes them and dehumanizes them, that can and does often lead to genocide. And that's the lesson. It's a universal lesson that us Jews have to be just as vigilant as any other group in making sure this never happens again to anybody. And that's the view taken by Israel Shahak, who, if you don't mind me just quoting one of the things he says in 1975, because I think it's just such a profound quote. He says, you can define Israeli society as a society in which there are no Israelis, but only Jews and non-Jews. You have separate tables for dying Jewish infants and dying non-Jewish infants. This is the Nazification of Jewish society, and this can well bring about the same calamity it brought in Europe, only a calamity to Arabs. If one can learn anything from the Nazi experience, it is that one should be against Nazism. I am against Nazism, whether German, Jewish, or Arab. And I think that quote nicely encapsulates the universal Jewish critique of Zionism. And that view is incredibly prescient. I mean, look what we're witnessing today. We are witnessing Jewish Nazism, the belief that one group of people is superior to another, and you should develop a whole state and a whole system of laws and a judicial system and an immigration system that privileges one group over another. And ultimately, it's that ideology that leads you down the road of Nazism, which is what we're witnessing today, which is when you get resistance from those groups, from, in this case, the Palestinian Arabs. Well, what is the solution? The solution is annihilation. And that's what we've been witnessing for the past 589 days.
Yeah, you kind of open and close with statistics about how the popularity of Zionism is diminishing, not just after October 7th and after the genocide we've been witnessing for over 500 days, as you just mentioned, but even leading up to October 7th. And most interestingly, you cite the statistic that says when you characterize Zionism in those sort of racial supremacist terms or ethno-supremacist terms, support for it drops even more dramatically. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, there was a researcher who conducted a poll a couple of years ago. It's before October 7th. This is in, I believe, 2022, in which she, before asking her participants, her who are participating in this poll, before asking them whether or not you identify as a Zionist or support Zionism, first she provided a definition of Zionism. And when she uses the innocuous or aspirational definitions of Zionism, such as Zionism is a belief in that Israel should be a Jewish and democratic state. Oh, what a great idea. Or Zionism is a belief that there's even an even more aspirational version of it. Jews should have a safe place to live, or something to that effect. We could pull the exact quote, but basically, Zionism has broad support, right? When you couch Zionism as some lofty aspirational ideology, great. Zionism is broadly something most Jews in the United States will support. But if you characterize Zionism by the lived experiences of its victims, that is to say, this 56-year-long grotesque military occupation of millions of Palestinians, 77 years of forced displacement, of a 17-year-long besiege of Gaza. So when you talk about, when you explain that Zionism is the belief that you should have more rights than others in the state of Israel, less than 10% of Jews in the United States call themselves or support Zionism. And
Isn't
that's
that
what Zionism
fascinating?
actually, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please. I just don't want to yada yada that. Like, fewer than 10% of Jews, when you characterize it as Jews in the United States, when you characterize it as should non-Jewish people have fewer rights than Jewish people in Israel, no longer support Zionism. What an incredible indictment and a kind of affirmation for folks like Norm Finkelstein, who've increasingly been talking about characterizing Zionism as a sort of Jewish supremacy, instead of using a term like Zionism that can be defined in these sort of innocuous, yeah, of course, Jewish people should be safe sort of ways. I mean, I'm curious what you make of that sort of a framing that he's been leaning into.
He's absolutely correct. A person who wants to believe Zionism was something that it wasn't is going to embrace these definitions of a Zionism that wasn't. We can talk about some fictional history of Zionism that never existed. And if you define yourself according to an ideology that was never implemented, you're just living on Mars. I mean, maybe go hang out with Elon Musk some more. But if you define yourself according to, if you want to talk about the Zionism that we've been living with, that we've been witnessing for the past 140 years, well, then Zionism is about privileging Jews, giving them more rights and more privileges than non-Jews in the state of Israel. There's no two ways about it. From 1948 until 1966, if you were a Palestinian Arab living in the state of Israel, you would need to apply for a military permit to leave your village to go visit your brother or your sister who lived 3 kilometers away from you. And oftentimes you were denied that right. You're telling me Jews and Arabs were equal for the first 18 years of the state's existence? I mean, you're just living in a fantasy world. And then for about 6 months, they lifted the military rule. But then in 1967, they just militarily occupied millions more Palestinians. So there's one historian who claims that Israel has been a democratic state for about 6 months of its existence. That brief 6-month period between the time Israel lifted the military rule that it had applied on Israel's Palestinian citizens and the time that it occupied Gaza and the West Bank and then subjected millions more Palestinians to permanent belligerent military occupation where they have no rights, they can't vote, they have no freedom of movement. They can't even wave a Palestinian flag for the first 30 years of that military rule. So what you're talking about is an ideology that really has never been democratic. So if you ask a Jew, do you believe, if Zionism is the belief that Israel is should be a democratic and a Jewish state, well then what you're saying is, do you believe in a fictional ideology?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to read the piece of your article that comes immediately after the quote that you read. You go on to say that it's often forgotten that multiple U.S. Jewish institutions kept Israel at arm's length until 1967, kind of pushing back against the kind of clean narrative that people weren't that interested, but then the extreme horror of the Holocaust motivated people to want some a kind of a refuge. You go on to write, in 1949, the Reconstructionist movement objected to Israel's blue and white flag with the Star of David because that would clearly discriminate against Palestinian Arabs. Quote, the Israeli flag is to represent the common national aspiration of all citizens of Israel, the movement stated. The American Jewish Committee, which represented many mainstream elite and secular U.S. Jews, was non-Zionist for assimilationist reasons until 1967. So that's an interesting sort of a gap there. And the articulation of why this movement doesn't want to embrace Zionism is so contemporary feeling in its sentiment. And yet it does feel even not even just contemporary, more advanced than where so many of us are today, because it felt like, at least until this sort of post-October 7th moment, the idea of saying the obvious, that a state that has such a large non-Jewish population in the middle of the Arab world, having a flag with a religious symbol on it complicates the idea, to put it lightly, of equal protection under the laws in that state, and also serves as a kind of incitement to folks who would transfer their discontent for the policies of Israel to all the Jewish people worldwide.
Jews have held more or less similar beliefs in every country in the world, save for Israel, more or less continuously over the past 140 years since Zionism came on the scene. Jews in every country in the world, again, save for the state of Israel, more or less believe that all people within the states that they live in should be treated equally before the law. Of course they think that way, because they have oftentimes been subject to discriminatory laws. So of course, go to Argentina, go to the United States, go to Germany, go to France, go to any country in the world today where you have Jews, and they all believe this. Not just by like a majority, by an overwhelming majority, maybe like 99% of Jews in every country in the world, again, save for Israel, believe that the states they live in should treat all people equally before the law, because they themselves understand, they know what it's like to be a second-class citizen. But as soon as you tell Jews, actually, we're not going to treat everyone equally before the law. We're going to give Jews more rights and more privileges, and then they all of a sudden are okay with it. And again, only in the state of Israel. So I think that's a pretty damning indictment of Israel itself, the Jewish character of Israel itself.
So obviously we have this pivot. Zionism becomes mainstream. There becomes this sort of collapsing, a very intentional collapsing between Judaism and Zionism. And I think everyone listening to this podcast at this point understands the institutional actors that have worked toward those ends, whether it's the Anti-Defamation League and their efforts to have various institutions adopt the definition of anti-Semitism that includes anti-Zionism, whether it's the media practice of repeating like a mantra that Israel has the right to exist, and pretending that anyone who feels differently is making a claim about the need to exterminate Jewish people as opposed to end a supremacist country, or in the supremacy, the kind of ethnic supremacy that is the land, the law of the land. But I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about some of the other kinds of institutional actors. For example, Hillel as an institution on college campuses. Post-October 7th, I became, I think, more aware in a way that I was not at all, that these institutions don't just serve as kind of, plain old religious institutions, but part of this sort of indoctrination or media project, if you will.
Yeah. Hillel International is, I hate to say it, it's a toxic organization. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan, we won't say exactly when, but when I was a student there, I was more religious. I was attending Saturday morning services, oftentimes going to the Orthodox Minyan, and I was also involved in the Palestine group my senior year. I kind of flipped, let's say, somewhere in my junior, senior year, right? Because I was raised very Zionist, but at some point I had an awakening and became much more supportive of Palestinian human rights. And in my senior year, I recall one Saturday morning where I was really torn because there was a protest that was being organized outside of the Hillel on the same day that I go to services at the Hillel. Was I going to go pray to God or protest against the organization that was waving the flag of an apartheid state in front of it? What do I do? I don't know. It's a very tough. You're forcing Jews to make a choice between their politics and their religious identity. It's awful. It's toxic. It's defaming Judaism is what it's doing. It's saying this is not a religious movement. This has nothing to do with spirituality. This is not about connecting to God or fixing the world or doing good deeds, right? It has nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism is a 3,300-year-old religion that is about God and the Torah and the Talmud and the Mishnah and Jewish law and Jewish ritual and prayer. And it has and Judaism existed long before Israel existed, and it will exist long after Israel ceases to exist. Judaism has an incredible amount of resiliency to it. I mean, Israel is incredibly fragile. This one is a religion, the other is a political ideology. And when you have an organization like Hillel, which says, no, they're actually the same. Zionism and Judaism are basically the same. It's incredibly toxic. And it leaves us Jews who have different political views basically outside of institutional Judaism. And we're not Jewish because we have different political views than you. It's toxic.
I mean, how many times have we heard various anti-Zionist Jews be told they're fake Jews in the last year and a half? I mean, it is curious to me. You mentioned being raised Zionist. I'm fascinated about what that looks like, what that feels like, and the way that has become increasingly visible, I think, post October 7th. I've talked to Jewish friends, and as we all know, thanks to Norm Finkelstein X's, about what that experience has been like, and as they've been reflecting on it with kind of fresh eyes after October 7th. And I'm curious what it's been like for you, and sort of given how outspoken you are in your work here as a historian of Palestine, what the dynamics have been like, both within your family and as you might continue to seek out a spiritual home within Judaism.
Yeah. Well, it's really tough. There's no two ways about it. It's really, really tough. How do you show up to pray at a synagogue where every Saturday morning they say a prayer for not just the state of Israel, not just in the sanctuary during the service, but they also say a prayer for the soldiers of the state of Israel. They say a prayer for wishing safety upon people carrying out a genocide. I mean, it would be the equivalent of entering a church in Germany in 1942, where they're praising Nazi soldiers, wishing safety on them as they send Jews off to the gas chambers. And that's every single shul in the United States. I mean, not every, but a huge percentage of the shuls and the synagogues in the United States say that prayer. I mean, it's insane. How can you feel welcome there?
I mean, how is it possible? Are there, how common are more progressive synagogues?
There's an anti-Zionist shul in Chicago. I forget the rabbi's name now. I mentioned him in the piece at the end. There are a few anti-Zionist or non-Zionist minions services popping up in places like New Jersey and New York. This is very recent. This is a post-October 7th development. I mean, this is sort of part of this Cambrian explosion of anti-Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jewish institutions. And so, yes, we are starting to see this change. But historically, traditionally, basically none. Like I said, one explicitly anti-Zionist shul, as far as I'm aware, in Chicago before October 7th. There were perhaps, again, if you go to California, you go to the West Coast, you will obviously find plenty of very progressive synagogues and Jewish organizations and institutions. But in terms of them being explicitly anti-Zionist and in terms of them being explicitly like Jewish religious institutions, as far as I'm aware, there was only one before October 7th.
Yeah, that I didn't fully appreciate. I went to, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before, but I went to my mom's goddaughter's bat mitzvah last year, and in New York, and what I understood to be a progressive synagogue is a progressive family. They are converts. It's like a whole story. And there were Israeli flags everywhere. But the part that was more surprising to me, because, you can put up a flag following October 7th in a way that doesn't seem so like core and institutional. It's just a kind of a reaction, a reactionary response. But in the songbook, the inclusion of the Israeli national anthem felt much more permanent and surprising to me. This isn't like a new book. You know what I mean? This is the old Warren book that's been sitting in the back of the pew for a long time. And to have the Israeli national anthem in there was kind of shocking to me.
Yeah.
Is that, are you familiar? Have you seen that? I mean, is this like a norm?
So that I'm actually not super familiar with. Usually the prayer that you would say, and the prayer that would be included in the prayer book, is a different prayer. It's called the prayer for the state of Israel. Avinu Shabashamayim Tzur Yisrael V'Golo,
Okay, so you're saying maybe it wasn't the anthem? Okay.
Yeah, so that's I mean, we're debating semantics basically. It's a prayer that for the state of Israel, which is different than the national anthem of the state of Israel, but
Okay.
6 of one, half a dozen of the other, same basic idea. Again, it's so far and beyond saying one or two prayers. I mean, I went to a synagogue in Detroit, Michigan, my hometown, Adat Shalom, where if you enter the sanctuary, you would have 240 chairs lined up in the sanctuary. I'm not talking about the lobby or the hallways outside of the sanctuary. The actual sanctuary, you have 240 empty chairs, and each chair has a photo of one of the hostages. Now, or prisoners of war. Now, maybe this is justified in the sense that this is a humanitarian gesture. Wow, don't we all wish for hostages to be released, right? Well, no, it's not humanitarian, because where are the 10,000 chairs for all the Palestinian hostages? They don't count as hostages, even though they haven't committed any crimes. They're just abducted off the streets of Gaza on the West Bank for committing a future crime. This is what Israel calls administrative detention, where it kidnaps Palestinians for having committed a crime in the future. In fact, it's not even that they've committed a crime in the future, they've committed a secret crime in the future, because the Israeli military courts and the Israeli military prosecutors don't even disclose what future crime they've committed, because it's secretive. And so they can't even present a legal defense. So they're just locked up, put in prison, and their 9-month or 12-month or 18-month prison term is potentially renewable indefinitely. So they haven't committed any crimes, and they're in prison potentially forever, while they're being tortured and raped and starved and exposed to the most dehumanizing conditions. We've had a few dozen, I forget the exact numbers, I think it's in the 40s, maybe the 50s by now, Palestinian prisoners killed in prison. They've been starved to death, they've been raped to death, they've been tortured to death. And this is, and so, yes, where are the 10,000 chairs for all the Palestinian prisoners and hostages? Well, there aren't any, because it's not a humanitarian gesture. It's a political slogan. So I'm sorry, you're not a nonprofit institution. You don't get nonprofit status. You should be stripped of that. You should have to pay taxes like every other political institution does. The 98% of Jewish institutions in the United States should all lose their nonprofit status. They're not nonprofit institutions. They're political organizations in support of apartheid and genocide. I mean, we need a complete refashioning and reorganizing, and we need to do away with almost every Jewish organization that exists today in the United States. They're all toxic. They're all genocidal. I'm sorry, that's just no other way of putting it. JVP is doing miracles. Jewish Voices for Peace, the largest anti-Zionist organization in the United States, as far as I can tell, full stop, Jewish, non-Jewish. They have 4 or 5 dozen some permanent full-time staff members. Find me another explicitly anti-Zionist political organization that has that large of a staff that is doing that much political work. The answer is there aren't any. So we're rebuilding, but it takes time.
Zach, are you still getting invited to Passover?
I mean, you joke about it, Brianna, but I have been uninvited from family things. It's real. I'm not welcome in certain family functions.
So was I. No, LOL.
Oh. You could say more about that.
That's not necessarily here nor there. Let me ask you about this, though. In all seriousness, you cite some stats toward the end of your piece about how polls are swinging wildly against Zionism among American Jews. Less granularly, more generally speaking, I have just felt another wave of this shift in the last week or so following explicit, there's been explicit genocidal statements throughout this whole thing, but a seemingly ratcheting up of the genocidal statements and the genocidal posture coming from the state of Israel, where the rate of killing of Palestinians has risen exponentially. And most recently, you had Smotrich saying, quote, "We are dismantling Gaza, leaving it in ruins with unprecedented destruction, and the world still hasn't stopped us," seemingly bragging about the impunity with which Israel is able to act in this moment. I saw a number of folks who have been silent or at least sort of manufacturing consent for the genocide because it was Biden's genocide. Folks like John Favreau from Pod Save America re-upping this, saying this is horrible. Democrats who were unwilling to criticize the genocide when Joe Biden was running now coming in to say this is terrible. A kind of rehabilitation, the likes of which we're also seeing with respect to Biden's health record this week, where people seem to be wanting to get out in front of what is no longer a whitewashable situation, even for the mainstream media. And I wonder if you've also observed this and what you make of this sort of heel turn.
Well, first, with regard to the Smotrich statements, Smotrich, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, they've been making genocidal statements for 19 months and counting. There's nothing new about these statements, right? I mean, if you read the ICJ's case, the case that South Africa brought before the International Court of Justice, charging Israel with genocide, there's about 5 pages of genocidal statements from Israeli leaders, right? Netanyahu said he likened the Palestinian people of Gaza to Amalek twice, the Amalek being the people that the biblical Israelites were commanded to annihilate, every man, every woman, every child, every goat, every ox. You had Yoav Gallant's famous statements, no food, no water, no electricity, no fuel. Then you had the Israeli soldiers, as they were carrying out the genocide, they were reciting and repeating those same genocidal statements as they were slaughtering Palestinians in Gaza. So you have the genocidal intent from the commanding officers, and then you have the repetition of that genocidal language by the soldiers actually carrying out the genocide. I mean, the fact that Smotrich says now we can get away with it shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone. They've been saying this for months and months.
Yeah, I agree. That's part of why it feels like there's been just permission given. Like after Biden's terrible debate, like it was obviously true that Biden was struggling cognitively and physically throughout for years. But after the disastrous debate, suddenly it was like everybody in the mainstream media was suddenly in the political sphere was given permission to say the obvious. And that's sort of what it feels like now. You're right. There's nothing really that novel about this most recent Smotrich statement, but the reaction to it is what's feeling novel.
I would say the difference now is that there has been no food, no water, not a morsel of bread, not a drop of water allowed into the Gaza Strip for 2 months and 1 day. Sorry, 3 months since March 18th. 3 months. I mean, we're talking 91 days. No food, no water, no electricity, no fuel, nothing, no medicine. There's children dying every single day, right? We've been talking about the looming starvation, but we're not talking about looming starvation anymore. We're talking about actual starvation, where kids every single day are dying from lack of food, lack of water. Your average well-to-do Palestinian in the Gaza Strip, someone who has access to humanitarian aid, someone who has connections abroad, has money. These people are eating 1 meal a day, or if not 1 meal every other day. Now imagine the 2 million people who have no access, who have no humanitarian aid coming in, who have no special connections. These people are just starving to death now in potentially the many dozens, hundreds every day. We don't know the true numbers. You have to recall starvation is slow to set in. And the people don't show up to the hospital starving to death. They die in their homes and their tents because they can't move. They have no energy. They can't walk. A person who hasn't eaten any food in 6 days can't walk to a hospital. They just die in their tent quietly and silently.
And not that there's any hospitals left.
Not that there's even any hospitals left. They just blew up, was it the European hospital, killing dozens of people just was it yesterday, the day before. There's no functioning cancer hospital left in Gaza. And to your point about Joe Biden, I'm sure his wife and his family are very sad, but what about the wives and the families of all the cancer patients in Gaza who don't have a hospital to go to because Joe Biden destroyed them all? What about them? I'm supposed to feel bad for Joe Biden? I'm sorry, I don't feel bad. And I'm sorry to say that. I should feel bad because cancer is awful and all human beings are created in the image of God and I should feel bad, but I don't. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, you certainly don't have to apologize here on this podcast, and I'm so glad you brought up the issue of the lack of humanitarian assistance. Just today, there are headlines advertising that Israel is allowing 5 aid trucks in without the context that prior to October 7th, at a point at which Gaza was already on a minimal calorie diet, 500 to 600 trucks were allowed in daily. And so they're letting in enough to feed a block, a city block. And there's reporting that there's not that much in the trucks. And also it's being administered by these, have you seen this? American sort of vigilante Halliburton types, as opposed to the aid workers, which are not being allowed access, the UN aid workers, the UNRWA workers that are still being precluded from meaningful access to the Strip.
The genocidification of humanitarian aid. I don't know what to call it. We're going to figure out a way of making sure that hundreds, if not thousands, of images of starving children aren't coming out of Gaza every day while fundamentally not changing anything about the status quo. That's what it is. It's the starvation has gotten so bad that you now have kind of rank and file members of the US Congress basically saying, look, Israel, you can do more or less what you want. We just can't see these pictures of emaciated children dying of starvation every single day. So it's lipstick on a pig. Without fundamentally changing anything about what we're doing in Gaza, we're going to continue the aerial bombardment campaigns in which we kill 20, 50, 100, 200 Palestinians every day. We're going to continue the siege. We're not fundamentally lifting the siege. We still control exactly what goes in and what goes out. We're not allowing the rebuilding of anything, right? We're not allowing mobile homes, concrete. You can't build anything. We're not allowing anyone to leave. Well, aside from the ones we hope to ethnically cleanse. So we're fundamentally not changing anything about the status quo other than the images of starving children is bad PR. That is the only thing that is changed. It's a PR strategy, but that's it, no more.
Yeah, I'm reading the Fuller Smotrich statement in the background, by the way. It's just, we are disassembling Gaza and leaving it as piles of rubble with total destruction, which has no precedent globally, and the world isn't stopping us. There are pressures, those who attack us, they are trying to make us stop. They are not succeeding. You know why they aren't succeeding? Because we are navigating the campaign responsibly and wisely, and that's how we'll continue to do it. I mean, now also there's this resurgence of Democratic acolytes who are blaming the uncommitted movement and conscientious objectors who declined to vote for Biden over Palestine, generally speaking, for Trump being in office, and then attributing the gravity, the escalation in Gaza to Donald Trump being president, even though Kamala Harris could not have been more clear that she was not departing from Biden's policy, which is Trump's policy in the region. I don't know if you've had much time to get into that, or you've observed this fight happening on the internet between this Harris spokesperson and all of the uncommitted folks that she's been attacking, or I don't know what they've been attacking. Yeah. What do you make of this?
If you were a single issue voter and your issue was Israel-Palestine and you were opposed to genocide, then I think it's pretty obvious that Trump was the pick and not Harris. And I'm not trying to say Trump is good on Israel-Palestine. No, he's genocidal just like his predecessor Biden was. But he got a ceasefire done. How many lives were saved during those 6 weeks of the ceasefire, those first 42 days? How many lives were saved. I don't know if it's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, but there were many lives that were in fact saved because of the ceasefire that Witkoff got signed. And we know it was Witkoff. I mean, everyone in the room has basically said it was Witkoff that forced Israel's hand. Netanyahu was not really interested in a ceasefire, which now has become obvious because we're back to where we were before. So again, I'm not saying Trump has been really, really all that great. I mean, obviously he's been awful, but it's not just the ceasefire he got signed. He's now clearly taking a position that is dramatically different than the position of his predecessor. Trump does not like to get bullied around. I mean, Trump likes to be the bully. So when you have someone like Netanyahu who shows up to the White House acting like he's the king, acting like he calls all the shots, that is obviously not somebody that the most narcissistic human being on planet Earth is going to like. And regardless of what you say about, that the spat, I mean, there was some reporting this past week that I'm sure you saw that, Trump is just fed up with Netanyahu. Who knows? I mean, this is all hearsay and rumor, and it almost doesn't even matter what he's saying. It matters what he's doing. And up until now, he got a ceasefire done and saved however many hundreds, if not thousands of lives. He let Netanyahu break the ceasefire that he was supposed to guarantee. Okay, obviously, that's pretty genocidal. But even in the past few weeks, he has been he said something to the effect of there are children in Gaza starving.
I think Iran is right now the big problem. That's also a problem. Hamas is big, and we want to take care of the people. Look, people are starving. You see what's going on right now. People are starving. One of the things that one of the three great leaders that I saw 2 nights ago said to me, please help the people, the Palestinians. I said, other than the obvious, what do you mean by that? He said, they're starving. And he meant it with his heart. They're starving. So I've already started working on that. It's a deep problem, but we'll get it solved. And a very immediate and a very big problem is, I'm so proud of what we were able to do with India and with Pakistan. Well, it's a potential problem like that we have here. I'll get it solved, and one way or the other I'll get it solved. It's either going to be done nicely or it's going to be done violently. And I 99.9% want to do it nicely if we can.
I mean, again, what I think we should be
it's tough because go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just think we should be focusing on actions, not words. I really could care less what people say. I could care less if they claim we're working tirelessly for a ceasefire. I could care less if they claim we're just so close to getting a ceasefire. What I care about is actions. And so far, yes, they've shipped weapons. I think 6 billion or so in terms of the amount of weapons that have been shipped to Israel since Trump took office, or maybe it was 3 billion. Now I'm forgetting the exact amount. Okay, so the weapons are still flowing, but it's pretty clear that was it Adam Bowler who went on CNN and told Jake Tapper, "We're not an agent of Israel." Mm-hmm. Who told Jake Tapper that Hamas are pretty decent guys, or they're just pretty average guys, or kind of like you and me, like don't have horns growing out of their heads, things that are just obvious statements of fact.
I spoke with Ron, and I'm sympathetic. He has someone that he doesn't know well, making direct contact with Hamas. Maybe I would see them and say, look, they don't have horns growing out of their head. They're actually guys like us. They're pretty nice guys. So he doesn't know me. And there are big stakes. He lives in a country where if it sets certain precedents, then it will hurt or help a lot of other people. So I understand the consternation and the concern, and I wasn't upset. At the same time, we're the United States. We're not an agent of Israel. We have specific interests at play.
I mean, can you imagine a Harris representative saying that? I can't.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the problem, because there are people like Mehdi Hassan's a good example of this, who see the sort of, we're at a height. Like this is about as bad as it gets in terms of number of Palestinians being killed a day. I mean, Israel's on a rampage right now. And they critique our part of the left for being overly credulous and taking at face value those kind of verbal representations and the sort of whisper machine leaks that say Trump is upset with Netanyahu, Trump doesn't like to be bullied, et cetera, at face value. Whereas when it was Biden and Biden was putting out, oh yeah, we're trying behind the scenes, Biden has a red line, Biden's at the end of his rope, we rightly called that out as an attempt to soften what was really happening, which was that Biden was fully allowing all of this. And I think there's a legitimate pushback that says, well, until you see results, all of the examples that you mentioned, going on TV and saying, we're not to be bullied, or this more recent quote that Trump allegedly said about Israel, we will abandon you if the war continues, should be taken with a grain of salt, and that we're being overly credulous. But I also take your point that there was a ceasefire, and that even if it is just rhetorical, the rhetoric from the Trump escalation represents an escalation over the rhetoric from the Biden administration, whatever that means.
What I would say as well is that this ceasefire could have been signed in May 2024. In fact, it was Biden that presented this deal as an Israeli deal back in, was it May? And Hamas agreed to it in July. There should have been a ceasefire in July. And the only reason why there wasn't a ceasefire is because Biden is a lifelong committed Zionist and is ideologically incapable of applying real pressure on Israel, whereas Trump is not ideologically incapable of applying pressure on Israel. And that is a fundamental difference between Trump and Biden. Biden believes that what he did for Israel is going to make him be remembered as the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history, and he's proud of that. Trump doesn't care about being remembered as pro-Israel. He cares about being remembered as the greatest president, and he wants a peace prize. Well, if he wants a peace prize, so all the incentives are aligned completely differently. Trump's incentives are actually get a deal, get a ceasefire. He's going to be the peacemaker of the Middle East. It's a completely different set of incentives. He doesn't care about Zionism. What the hell Trump doesn't even know what Zionism is. He has no ideological imperative or at all. He's just focused on himself and banking wins for himself and his cronies. And that leaves open the possibility of a better future for the Palestinians than an ideological worldview, which says Israel's always right, which says I have to support Israel. And that's what I would say about the difference between Biden and Trump on Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, this is from a new New York Times article that just dropped, minutes ago. We're recording this on Monday, the 19th. This is about Trump's golf tour. It's titled "Trump Shrugs Off Netanyahu on Golf Tour on Iran, Gaza, Syria, Yemen. President Trump is moving ahead without Israel, reshaping decades of foreign policy." The article says, in recent decades, under U.S. presidents from both parties, Israel has largely enjoyed a special place at the center of American foreign policy in the region. Mr. Netanyahu, who has been in power for much of the past 2 decades, was always an essential player in the Middle East debate, even as he sometimes infuriated his American counterparts. There is no indication that the United States is abandoning its historic ties with Israel or will stop its military and economic support for the country. During his flight on Air Force One from Riyadh to Doha, Mr. Trump dismissed concerns about sidelining Israel. Quote, "No, not at all," he told reporters. "This is good for Israel, having a relationship like I have with these countries, Middle Eastern countries, essentially all of them." But Mr. Trump's 5-day tour through the Middle East this week underscored a new dynamic, one in which Israel, and Mr. Netanyahu in particular, is something of an afterthought. In Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, Mr. Trump has sought to negotiate peace deals in Iran and Yemen and cut trillion-dollar business deals with the wealthy nations in the Persian Gulf. He did not make a stop in Israel. Make of that what you will, and also make of the New York Times emphasizing that what you will.
Well, New York Times.
It almost reads like the New York Times is a little mad at Donald Trump for this is like a Trump hit piece because Trump is distancing himself from Israel. You know what I mean? That's the New York Times maybe this is unfair of me, but that's the tone that I'm picking up from this piece.
Well, leaving aside the New York Times question, which we can address after, but specifically with regard to this Trump visit to the Gulf, recall that Trump's greatest foreign policy achievement, by his own understanding of his foreign policy agenda and his supporters, was the Abraham Accords, in which Israel signed not peace deals. It's oftentimes falsely characterized as peace deals. No, they were normalization deals between Israel and UAE, Qatar, Morocco, and Sudan. Now, what was the essence of those quote unquote those normalization deals? It was so that these Arab autocratic states can buy arms and spy tech from the state of Israel. That was the point of the deal. That is oftentimes lost in the coverage. 25% of Israel's arms exports go to those four countries. 25%, you're talking billions in arms every year, so that they can repress their own population, so they can silence dissent within their own countries. That was the point of the deal. Now, so Trump is picking up where he left off. He's trying to expand the Abraham Accords. The real achievement, the one that he failed to get in V1, was the deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that is the deal he's hoping to get, because Saudi Arabia being, by far, let's say, the most important Gulf country, the most important, one of the, if not the most important Arab states, just owing to its oil wealth, owing to its ability to garner support around the Muslim and Arab worlds for all kinds of reasons, religious, political, military, etc. This is the deal that would become the crowning achievement of his presidency. This is what he's obsessed with. He wants an Israel-Saudi normalization deal. And he realizes that he can't really get that deal. I would hope he realizes, maybe he doesn't, but he should realize that he's not going to get that deal unless there is a resolution to the Israel-Palestine question. That doesn't have to be a Palestinian state per se. I think the Saudis would accept some kind of normalization long before there was the existence of a Palestinian state. But there has to be at least an end to the genocide. And so I do think that actually if there's any hope for an end to the genocide in Gaza, it's Trump's obsession with this normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. By the way, which is also an obsession of his senior staff members, chief among them Jared Kushner, who has very, very close ties to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself. I mean, Kushner signed, what was it, like $1 billion or $2 billion deal between his private equity fund? They got a ton of Saudi investment. So clearly there's like a lot of interest in the Saudi deal, but there's no way they're going to get a deal if they don't end the genocide. So I think that should leave us at least some hope for prospects for a deal. I would say similar things about other states in the region. Again, the only way Trump is gonna bring in more states, because it's not just Saudi Arabia, right? He wants to bring in the entire Arab world. He wants this normalization deal, the Abraham Accords. He wants to bring in the entirety of the Arab world into this deal. Trump, the deal maker. That's what he wants to be remembered as. So there is some hope, I think, that we're going to see an end to the genocide if Trump is really serious about getting the Israeli-Saudi Arabia normalization deal and more generally expanding the Abraham Accords.
But Zach, what does that even look like? I mean, I don't want to diminish that there are still 2 million people in Gaza whose lives are quite literally hanging in the balance and are being killed in the dozens as we speak. But it's also a scenario where all meaningful buildings, infrastructure, everything has been destroyed. Every hospital, every educational institution, cemeteries dug up. I mean, we know the magnitude of the devastation. And as a consequence, Israeli leadership, Zionist leadership in other parts of the world are now feel like they have, I think, the credibility to claim that an ethnic cleansing effort to move Palestinians elsewhere is a humanitarian effort, because there is nothing infrastructurally left. And so when you say an end to the genocide, my concern is that what that looks like is simply a pivot to the ethnic cleansing section of our program.
Yeah, you're right. The problem is convincing another state to accept Palestinian refugees without a guarantee that they'll be allowed to return, right? That's what Israel is struggling with. You saw the headline just this past week: 1 million Palestinians from Gaza are going to be allowed to go to Libya. And then the U.S. Embassy in Libya said this is fake news, because no state in the world is going to be complicit in the genocide and the ethnic cleansing. There's nobody. Not even a state like Libya, which is, effectively a failed state, cantonized, balkanized, with various military factions controlling various parts of the country. There's no state in the world that would allow themselves to be characterized as complicit in Israel's genocide. Can you name one? So no, it's just not going to happen. I can't see any state in the world that would be that enslaved to the United States. I mean, Libya might be close because, that is a failed state. They need loan guarantees, right? They need funding from the U.S. They want United States support. So that's going to be the incentive, whether it's Libya or whether it's some other country. There's going to be attempts to bribery and probably other blackmail, right? Trump will use, and his lackeys will use whatever they can to compel world leaders and states around the world to accept Palestinian refugees, but it's not going to happen. I just don't see it happening. I mean, Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he's going to open the border after keeping it closed for 19 months. All of a sudden, he's going to have a change of heart. No, because he knows it's going to lead to the overthrow of his regime. You're going to have Egyptians protesting on the streets in the many hundreds of thousands. The same would happen in Jordan, where you have more than half the population is already Palestinian, and they're already disgusted by the king and the monarchy's genocidal take on the whole war in Gaza. They have done nothing to support the Palestinians. They've allowed Israeli planes to fly over Jordanian airspace to carry out attacks on Iran and Syria. So no, those two states are not going to budge. I can't imagine if they haven't budged yet, what would lead them to change their views? A few billion? I mean, I highly doubt that. It's not worth the risk of the downfall of the regime.
So then when we say Trump is really invested in the genocide ending, what do we actually mean?
I don't know. I think he would look. If you had to ask me where things are headed from here, which is basically the question, it's we're witnessing right now in the past week this renewed Israeli offensive in the Gaza Strip, right? So a lot could happen just in the next few weeks. But thinking a little bit further out, Israel's plan is to permanently militarily reoccupy the Gaza Strip with soldiers on the ground, with soldiers and boots on the ground. I mean, this is just a recipe for an ongoing insurgency that's going to last for years, if not decades to come, until Israel withdraws again. I mean, that's why they left the first time in 2005. During Israel's quote-unquote disengagement plan, when it withdrew its 6,000 to 7,000 illegal settlers in the Netzarim corridor and Gush Katif, and they took them out, and it kind of like they were having a lot of problems because this came at the tail end of the Second Intifada, the most violent period in all of Israeli history for Israelis in Israel, where they were being subjected to constant attacks, both civilian and military. And so you had the Israeli settlers living in Gaza being attacked, Israeli soldiers being attacked. 1,000 Israelis were killed during those 5 years. And most of them were civilians from 2000 to 2005. And that led them to leave Gaza. I mean, leave. They obviously still had total control of the Gaza Strip. That's why every international legal expert still called it a military occupation, because they didn't leave. They just relocated their soldiers to the perimeter. It's kind of like if you're controlling a prison, you let one or two of the prisoners decide who gets how much food and who gets to take walks out into the prison courtyard, and you just withdraw to the perimeter so you don't have to deal with the mess and the chaos that's happening on the inside of the prison. That was Israel's approach. And now their approach is, you know what? No, we do want to be in the prison, and we want Palestinian snipers to be shooting us every single day forever. That's the decision they're making now, to just subject Israeli 18, 19, 20-year-olds to just slaughter every day. It's just very strange. Like, what is the goal? So what I think is going to happen over the course of the next, let's say, beyond this military incursion. So once they establish their positions and once they convince these American contractors, these kind of ex-military, these private contractors to serve as soldiers for genocide, once they convince them to set up shop at 3 or 4 locations in Rafah and start dealing out morsels of food, they're just going to face a low level of insurgency that will eventually, I don't know if it's in 5 years or in 10 years, but it will eventually lead them to withdraw again. Because that's what they did in Lebanon in 2000. After they invaded Lebanon in 82, they occupied Lebanon for 18 years, and their soldiers were just being picked off one at a time. And eventually, like, why are we here? What are we doing here? What's the point of all this? We're just senselessly dying to occupy territory that doesn't belong to us, that we have no business being in the first place. That's where I see this going. Just a low-level genocide. Every day there'll be maybe, 50 Palestinians killed rather than 150. And every day there'll be 1 or 2 soldiers killed. And eventually Israeli civil society will have enough of it in 10 years.
I mean, this is genuinely, I mean, it's been said a million times before, but genuinely just the bleakest reality of my political life, of our probably collective political life. And especially these last few days when there's been this heel turn in the mainstream media, I've been reflecting on the debates that I had on Rising until I was fired almost exactly a year ago. And what it was like 3 days after October 7th, 3 weeks after October 7th, 3 months after October 7th, having these conversations with Robbie where you had to fight upwind against this benefit of the doubt that was extended to Israel and this presumption that any innocent killed was an accident if Israel did it, that it was anti-Semitic to suggest that they would ever be purposefully violating international law or bombing a hospital or literally digging up cemeteries. I like that example because there, of course, is no military rationale for digging up a cemetery. It's obviously not the worst thing by a mile that they've done, but I find it to be instructive. Even at the time, remember, they told CNN, I think they let a CNN crew in about that story. They told CNN that there was like Hamas under the cemetery, and then they had drawn a map, and the map was of some tunnel that was like not under the cemetery. Anyway, we've all been through it, but like, especially in this moment when suddenly there's been this permission given to say what many of us were saying 3 days and 3 weeks after, it like makes it doubly, it's painful all over again. Because back then, I remember when it was like, 5,000 dead. And that seemed and was an astronomical and deeply painful number. And I remember saying 5,000 people got killed. Okay, October 7th, 1,200 people, whatever the numbers were higher back then before they revised them down. But if you even believe in an eye in the eye, if we're doing the Old Testament here, okay, you got your lick back. What is the continued justification? People who are experts, people who understand this conflict know and are telling you that Israel is using this as a justification to do a final solution for Palestine. The writing is on the wall. It's clear as day. And to have been confronted with not just disbelief in that moment, in those moments, but also being characterized as anti-Semitic at worst, or just deeply naive and stupid at best, there is no comfort, is what I'm trying to say, in having people come on board now that the number is potentially 200,000 and not 5,000. It makes it worse. Every part of it just feels worse, cumulatively worse, because it was avoidable.
Look, I've been writing about Palestine for a long time, long before October 7th. And we've been talking about not just apartheid, but the underlying problem with the ideology of Zionism for many, many years. And the basic problem of Zionism was outlined by Patrick Wolf in a famous essay called The Logic of Settler Colonialism. And every settler colonial movement in New Zealand, in Australia, in South Africa, in the United States, in Canada, and many other places has an underlying logic that leads to the elimination of the native. But now we don't need an academic to theorize the logic of the elimination of the native. We can turn on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and watch the logic of the elimination of the native happen every single day for 590 days. And I do think that, to bring this conversation full circle, I do think that is why we're seeing a complete collapse, a complete crumbling of Zionism among US American Jews who, for the first time, are waking up to the reality of this ideology. And so ultimately, I think that Zionism as an ideology is going to go away in the United States. Jewish institutions in the United States will eventually reject Zionism. It will no longer be okay to call oneself a Zionist, as former US President Joe Biden did, because Zionism has been revealed for what it is. It's a movement to eliminate the native. I mean, just ask yourself this, Brianna. If you were a Zionist in 1897, when Theodor Herzl published The Jewish State, wouldn't it have been a dream had the land actually been empty? Wouldn't it have been a dream? And that's all you need to know. Well, of course, Zionism leads to the logic of the annihilation and the elimination of the native. Of course it does. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the settler colonial movement, is to replace the natives with the settler population. And so there's debates, at 48, 67, did Zionism end in 48, or does it continue in 67? These are stupid debates. Okay, so Zionism is only slightly genocidal rather than totally genocidal. Okay, so it's just genocide. We're only going to genocide a smaller number rather than the whole number. No, it's genocide in whole or part. It's genocidal either way. The underlying logic of the ideology itself is genocidal. I mean, and I hate to put it that in such direct, blunt terms, but it took us 130 years to finally witness the eventual, what we all knew was inevitable. I mean, I published a piece a few months back on genocidal rhetoric in the state of Israel before October 7th. It goes back decades. This isn't new. It goes back decades. I mean, 2018, Avigdor Lieberman, then defense minister, not some obscure military officer, the defense minister, the person in charge of the Israeli army, he said there's no such thing as an innocent person in Gaza. That was 4 or 5 years before the genocide started. It's coming from the Israeli left. You had an Israeli politician, Ehud Olmert's son, I believe. Yair Olmert, if I'm not wrong. I could be messing up his first name. He said in 2012, this is an Israeli leftist politician, then part of the Kadima party, if I'm not wrong. He said in 2012, flatten Gaza. I mean, we've known for decades that Israelis and Zionists have been calling for the complete destruction of Gaza. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin in 1992, the quote-unquote Israeli peacemaker, who signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians, and the leftist Israeli leader who's going to finally bring an end to the conflict. He said, while he was campaigning for prime minister in 1992, he said, push Gaza into the sea. He said, I promise to push Gaza into the sea. In 1992. And you go back to 48, Ben-Gurion was likening Palestinians to Nazis in 1948. Of course, it all stems from the underlying ideology of building a Jewish state in a country of mostly non-Jews. And we're finally witnessing the final solution of that, solving that problem, solving the Arab problem. It's finally arrived.
I saw an Abby Martin clip recently where she said she was wrestling with her own role as a journalist because, she's been covering this issue so valiantly for so many years. And, before the idea was, well, if you inform people, if people know what's really going on, then maybe there'll be a change. And now being confronted with the reality that everybody knows and still nothing changes, it's very destabilizing. To broaden this out a little bit, though, I mean, this is the fundamental, for people who are watching the show, they know that this is sort of my beat. When we say it's an oligarchy, when we say we don't have a real democracy, it's this and myriad other issues where we're not doing awareness campaigns anymore. We don't need to convince people of the need for universal health care. This is not a persuasion game anymore in so many important respects and on so many important issues. And until we start having a different kind of conversation about actually fixing that core problem, the complete and total severance between our leadership institutions and the will of the public, we're all just yapping into the void. And that's why I think these conversations about general strikes and labor actions and, other ways to shut down commerce have to be so central to what we're doing on the left, and why we'll wrap with this. I don't know if you saw Bernie Sanders sat down with Andrew Schultz on his group podcast, and basically admitted under some pretty decent questioning from Schultz. I would have loved to ask Bernie this question and a few follow-ups that Schultz doesn't get to, by the way, if he were ever to condescend to visit left media as opposed to right media, and visit his own old national press secretary, by the way. Just an interesting concept. But he basically, asks him, like, he says to him, I was disappointed that, the Democratic Party rigged the election against you, and I was disappointed that you endorsed Hillary Clinton and implicitly Joe Biden. And Bernie doesn't really push back. And basically says, well, what are you going to do if we let the Republicans win and kids lose healthcare and food, and I owe something to my representatives? And Andrew Schultz kind of accepts that.
The problem I think a lot of voters had is like they didn't even know if it was her. We didn't even know if Biden was president. We didn't even know if these were her talking points. And we felt that over the last 4 elections, Democrats, we felt that we didn't have a say on who could be president. We talk a lot about the Republicans being autocrats and oligarchs and taking over democracy, but from the Democrat perspective, and I'm a lifelong Democrat, I felt like the Democratic Party completely removed the democratic process from its constituents. And I think they need to have some accountability of that.
No argument here.
I donated for you. I wanted you to, like, 2016, I was like, this is going to happen. This guy's going to do it. And it felt like they stole it from me. And I'll be honest, it broke my heart when you supported him.
Look, but you have, in the world that I live in, you got a choice. And I mean, a lot of people, including my wife, agree with you. But, you're down to a choice. Is it going to be Hillary Clinton or is it going to be Donald Trump? Not a great choice.
But it ended up being him anyway, so why don't we burn it down?
Well, because it's easy to say burning it down means that children are not going to have, food to eat, that the schools will deteriorate, people will not have health care.
I got it.
And I'm an elected official. I got to represent the people.
That's fair.
And I can't turn my back on.
But then could we not also say, if ostensibly there hasn't been a fair primary for the Democrats since 2008, are they not also a threat to democracy? Yes. We often hear...
Fair enough. That is, yeah, I'm not going to argue with that point.
I don't accept that, because the consequence of never calling out the oligarchy except on an off-cycle campaign trail tour with AOC is that you enable exactly what's happening in Gaza. I'm sorry. We're living in the world without litmus tests. We're living in the world where you decide there are no red lines because Trump is bad. And to Andrew Schultz's point, you get Trump anyway. So anyway, I've taken it down on quite a frolicking detour. I appreciate your effort there at the end to bring us back to the topic of the article. You did a great job. I appreciate you, Zachary. Tell people where they can find more of you and your work on the internet and beyond.
First of all, before I do that, I just want to tell your audience, and if any Bernie followers or supporters or staffers are listening to this, Bernie, you should do an interview with Brianna Gray. That's the least you could do for her, as she served on your staff as media director. If folks want to follow
National Press Secretary, I wish I were head of comms. I would like to say also, for the record, people who attribute bad comm strategy of the Bernie 2020 campaign to me, I don't necessarily agree with all of the criticisms, but I literally was not the head of the comms department. I was the National Press Secretary. Your beef is with Mike Casca, who is currently running AOC's comms, not me.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
I apologize for that mistake. Yeah, for those who want to follow my work, you can follow me on social media. You'll find me _ Zach Foster on Twitter or Instagram. It's Zachary Foster. And then if you want to follow my newsletter, where I publish pieces like the one we talked about, you can subscribe to that newsletter at PalestineNexus.com, where I also offer courses on a history of Zionism and a history of the Palestine question.
Invaluable work. Thank you so much, Zach. I appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you to all the listeners. If you haven't subscribed to listen to the recent interview with Glenn Loury, it really is one of my all-time favorites. We go for 2 hours. He was so generous with his time, and he was so vulnerable and willing to talk about this sort of late career evolution on the question of how central race is to politics as a Black conservative who has been so sort of front and center in his critiques of a certain kind of racialized politics, identity politics, and things like that. how the issue of Palestine and the racialized nature of the genocide and his experience as a Black man growing up in apartheid America makes it impossible for him to ignore the relevance of race in that issue and potentially others. So if you haven't already subscribed, he also talks about some behind the scenes stuff with his recent interview with Tucker Carlson about having been canceled by the Manhattan Institute for expressing pro-Palestine views. So you're going to want to subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast to listen to that, and a backlog of almost 500 episodes at this point. You can all find them all over there. So thanks for that. Thanks for supporting the podcast. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.